Hello, my name is Bree, and I'd like to welcome you to my channel, Breezy Banter, a place where I talk about the things I want to talk about. In today's video, I thought that I could do a media roundup of most of the media that I consumed during the month of April. I know it's really common in the beauty sphere to do monthly favorites. I just don't use enough new makeup to really do a similar concept, but I do consume a lot of media, and I think it'd be a nice way to catalog some of my thoughts on movies, TV shows if I watch them, games, and books. So if you're interested in hearing about the things that I watched, read, or played this month, then keep on watching. One thing that I'll mention up front is I made it sort of an unofficial goal to read fewer books this year and to watch more movies and play more games. The reason behind this is because I read a lot of books, and while that's something that I love and adore and I don't foresee that going anywhere, I think there have been times in years past where I think I would have preferred to just relax a little bit more and focus on really delving into a movie or a game and not putting so much pressure on myself to read. I wasn't exactly sure how to word such a goal, so just be aware that I'm reading fewer books than I did last year, and I'll be likely playing more games and watching more movies than I did last year as well. And so the first category that I'm going to start with are the movies that I watched this month. I watched 5 movies, and this is probably pretty typical. I watch about 1 to 2 movies a week, depending on the week and depending on what's coming out. Some months are slower than others, but 5 movies this month, and I anticipate seeing a few more than 5 next month. We'll see how it goes. So the first movie that I watched is Porco Rosso, which is a movie by Studio Ghibli. It came out in 1992, so it's one of the older films, and I really enjoyed this. As an engineer, there are aspects of engineering that are shown in the film, and one of the main characters is a female engineer. I tend to enjoy everything that comes out of Studio Ghibli, even if they don't tend to be my favorite films. So for this one, I'm going to give this an A ranking. The next movie that I watched was Problemista, and I believe this was a directorial debut, and it's about a young man who is living in the US on a visa, and he suddenly loses his employment, and he's tasked with finding another way to reside in the US by finding another employer to sponsor him. This was a drama comedy type film, and I quite enjoyed it. There's some magical realism in the film that I really liked. I thought the acting was fantastic. The main character is played by the director, so that was really cool to see. It features Tilda Swinton, who I just think she's a fantastic actress. So this was a fun, enjoyable watch. I'd probably put this in the B tier. The next movie that I watched is Late Night with the Devil, which is a A24 horror film. So I tend to adore A24 films. They really hit that indie niche of featuring films that are just a little bit different than mainstream, but they tend to have a big enough budget where they can still make interesting films. And Late Night with the Devil is a horror film. Horror films tend to be hit or miss for me, and this one I would say was kind of average. I know that the film has been a bit lampooned for its use of AI. I'll be honest, I feel bad that I'm really bad at detecting AI in media, so I didn't even notice it in the film. I think there are some things that I suspect were AI, but I don't actually know if what I think is AI was actually AI. So that's just something to be aware of if that matters to you. But I thought for a horror film, it was quite good. But in terms of films in general, probably just average. I would give this a B. The next film that I watched is Satin Wants You. It's a film about the Satanic Panic back in the 1980s, based on the book Michelle Remembers, that has largely been disproven at this point in time. It was really interesting to watch this film. It was a documentary, and I think it's just really sad what happened, some of the repercussions. I suspect some of the people really did believe some of the things that they were saying, but I also suspect that some people were being opportunistic liars. So it was really interesting to see that dynamic. And it's something that still pops up from time to time, even in modern day discussions. So it was nice to get some historical information on that as well. And for this one, I give this a B. The film that I started out the month with watching is Ponyo, which is another film by Studio Ghibli. And this one, again, quite enjoyed, as I tend to do with Studio Ghibli films. And this one has, I would say, a bit more of a magical realism sense than Porco Rosso does. There are some really interesting themes that I think are explored. I don't really want to go into too much detail because I think the storyline is quite straightforward, and so I don't want to give away any spoilers. But this was a really enjoyable watch that I think would appeal to both younger and older audience members. And for this one, I give it a B. In terms of the games that I play, I don't think I've specifically mentioned on here, but I tend to enjoy indie games that are Metroidvanias, platformers, puzzle platformers, 2D or 3D action adventure exploration type games. I don't tend to get into the narrative as much depending on the nature of the game. That said, if a game is heavily narrative based, then I might play it for that reason. But I find often, particularly in action and adventure games, that there is usually a storyline. It's just that's not usually what's engaging me. So I'm looking for things like design. What's the atmosphere like? Is it drawn in a pretty enticing way? And as well as gameplay in terms of combat, movement, retraversal of terrain, and general UI. Like, is there a map? Is the map intuitive to use? So those are generally the ways in which I'm judging a game. So the most recent game that I finished is Axiom Verge, which is a game made by one person, which is, if you've played it, is absolutely incredible because that game feels like it's made by a solid team. There is Axiom Verge 2 that has come out more recently, which I haven't played. I'm not sure if I'm going to pick it up. That said, Axiom Verge is an excellent game. If you enjoy Metroidvanias and you enjoy combat and exploration and being rewarded for exploration, I think this is a really solid pick. I think the soundtrack is incredible. It's not music that I tend to listen to on my own, but inside of the game, it really amplifies what it is that you're doing. I thought the boss fights were quite nice. There were some things that I think could be improved, particularly the way in which the map is displayed to you and what certain things mean aren't necessarily made all that clear to the player. And by that, I mean that, for example, in the map in the game, there are 2 indicators that might show up on that map indicating that you've found all of the items, and one to indicate that you've explored 100% of that particular area. However, as far as I'm aware, this is never explained to you at any point in the game. So at some point, you may or may not check your map and see that there's a little dot, and you'll have no idea what that means unless you look it up. And then you'll find out that, oh, that means that I've either found all of the items or I've discovered 100% of the area in the game. This can be a big deal to me because I enjoy completing games in the sense that I enjoy getting 100% achievements. So if there are things that exist within the game to indicate to me completion, but it's not clear to me that that's what they're indicating, it can be a bit of a frustrating experience. And for this game, I give it an A. The next game that I played was We Were Here Expeditions: The Friendship, which is a part of the We Were Here game series. If you've played it before, then this game is exactly what you would expect from the series. That said, if you haven't played it, it's basically a 2-person puzzle game where communication is of utmost importance. There's asynchronous information that is available to you and your partner, and so you have to be able to communicate to your partner what it is you're seeing, what information you think you might need, and then your partner must do the same, and then together you must solve problems. I quite enjoyed this addition to the series. I found it to be probably the strongest in the entire series, which is a bit funny to me because I'm pretty sure I picked this up for free during like a free weekend. I believe you have to pay for it now, but if you are able to get your hands on it, or if you're looking for a 2-person puzzle game, then this is a great option. And for this, I give it a B. The next game that I played is Content Warning, which is one of the many additions to the multiplayer horror genre. There are some other games in this genre that I love playing with my friends, such as Phasmophobia. That said, I got this game for free, and I'm glad that I did because I suspect had I paid for it, I would have been disappointed. It was free for perhaps a week or a weekend, something like that. And I got a couple of hours of fun out of it. I suspect that game kind of maxes out at a couple hours. Whereas with games like Phasmophobia, I've like well over 100 hours in that game. The replayability of it is quite high. Whereas with Content Warning, I feel like I've kind of seen all that I'm going to get from it, and so it's just less interesting as a result. That said, because I did get it for free, that is something in its favor. It did give me a couple hours of fun with friends, and so for this, I give it a C. Because this is my first media roundup, I'm going to briefly mention that I'm currently playing 3 games, 2 of which I suspect will take me perhaps multiple months to complete. So one is Enter the Gungeon, which is a roguelite sort of dungeon crawler where you can play co-op or alone, and you have to clear a dungeon, fight bosses, and do so many times. That's kind of the entire point of a roguelite. And I have only perhaps 10 or so hours in the game, and I suspect that I'll have many more, again, because I want to get 100% achievement completion. But that is one that I return to time and time again. I'll give a fuller review once I've actually completed it. I'm also playing Dragon's Dogma. I had originally wanted to complete this before Dragon's Dogma 2 came out. That said, I've heard some mixed feedback on Dragon's Dogma 2, so I'm glad to focus on Dragon's Dogma at this time. It's somewhat similar to Skyrim in that it's a open world, kind of historical, dragon-focused type game, as you might expect from the title, and I'm quite enjoying it so far. I think there are some ways in which it shows its age. That said, I probably, again, have maybe 10 hours or so into it, and I think I have several more hours of content to go. And similar to Enter the Gungeon, I'll provide a fuller review once I've completed the game. Next, I'm playing Lost in Random. I've completed perhaps a sixth of the game thus far, and again, I'll give a fuller review once I complete it. This game is like a Tim Burton-esque puzzle, action-adventure exploration type game. It's a bit difficult to describe. My understanding is there will be some combat at some point in the future, but I have yet to really come to that in the amount of time that I've played. There's also a fair amount of focus on the story that's involved, and I've been really enjoying that thus far. As I mentioned earlier, I don't tend to play games for the narrative. That said, I've been enjoying the narrative of this game. So next I'm going to move on to the books that I've read this month. I don't think it's worthwhile for me to discuss every single book that I've read because I do just tend to read quite a lot. That said, what I'm going to do is focus on what I think are some of the more interesting books that I've read, or books that I might have something that I think is interesting to share. So I'm currently in the middle of trying to complete 4 mangas or graphic novels. And so I've completed a few this month, and I'll give my full review of the entire series once I've completed the entire series. That said, I do just want to mention what they are and some brief thoughts. So the first series that I'm reading is Blood on the Tracks. I've read the second to last novel this month, and my understanding is the very last one will be coming out in September 2024. And I cannot wait for that date to happen because I basically read the first 4 or so volumes. I've read 1 a day, and then I just couldn't help myself and I read 10 the next day. They were so good, so captivating. The series is sort of a psychological horror type series. To me, it's a really compelling and interesting story. I think the way it's drawn is very good. The characters are interesting, and I'm so excited to see how it ends and how it all gets wrapped up, and I know that's just a few months away. The next series that I'm reading is Dorohedoro, which I understand that there is also an anime that is based on the books. This manga is quite violent, it's quite graphic, it's weird, for lack of a better word. If you enjoy things that are a little different than normal or quite a bit different than normal, this would be a good pick. Everything's just a little strange, and it's a bit difficult to describe how that is. It's the characters are odd, the way that they talk are odd, the worlds are odd, but I am enjoying it. It's not my favorite by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm enjoying my read. The next graphic novel that I'm reading is Outcast. I've only read 2 volumes, so I'm not that far into it. That said, thus far, the storyline is quite interesting, and I find the way that it's drawn to be really appealing. It has some gorgeous artwork. And the last series that I'm working on completing is Berserk. And so Berserk was recommended to me because my understanding is a lot of Souls games, particularly Elden Ring, is actually based on these books. And I can sort of see that now that I've made perhaps 3/4 of my way through the books. That said, there are some aspects of Berserk that I detest. I won't talk about it now until I've completed the entire series, but there are some ways in which I think Berserk kind of exemplifies, let's say, the mainstream criticism that is so common of manga, which is depiction of women, depiction of sexual violence, that sort of thing, that I think it doesn't do a very good job of handling it, and so that's quite off-putting to me. And aside from that, I think the story is quite interesting and good. The characters are interesting, but that is just a big chunk of the story that I have to just set aside to be able to enjoy the rest of it. At least that's been my experience thus far. I've heard it gets better, I've actually heard that the author has regrets about the way that he wrote some of these novels because he was quite young when he wrote them. So I might look into that once I've completed it to see how his views have changed since he originally wrote these books. I could be mistaken, but I believe there are 42 volumes that are out. The author, however, has died, and so somebody is taking over from him for writing them. That said, my understanding is that the person that is taking over for writing the series was very closely connected to the original author, and so he doesn't want to take any liberties with where the story is going. He wants to write the remaining books based on what he knew about where the original author wanted to go with the books, which I think is pretty interesting and respectable. I believe that there's perhaps 10 to 12 more books that remain. Next, I'm going to move on to discussing books that are standalone books. So the most recent book that I read was The Secret Lives of Color. In this book, the author delves deep into 75 different colors and discusses the significance of the color, some of the history behind the color, and interesting facts about the color. And I really enjoyed this. There were some things that I knew going into the book that I just got to relearn, but there were some really interesting facts in the book that I had never heard of and hadn't even thought of. So if you have any interest whatsoever in color, I think that this would be a really interesting book for you to pick up. And for The Secret Lives of Color, I give this an A rating. The next book that I read was The Creative Act, which, similar to The Secret Lives of Color, is a nonfiction book. And it really discusses creativity and basically everything about creativity, the best way to be creative yourself, the best way to think about creativity. But it's not necessarily written in a self-help kind of way. And it was a bit of a quick read, but it was quite helpful to me, particularly given that I'm embarking on this creative pursuit. And with that in mind, I give this book an A rating. The next book that I read was Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America. And this was by the same author who wrote Fantasyland, which, if you haven't read Fantasyland, it's a nonfiction book. It's a bit difficult to describe, but it's kind of about untruths, for lack of a better word. But the book is so good. And so I was really interested to read this other book that he recently came out with. It didn't disappoint. I don't think it's quite as strong as Fantasyland, but by its own merits, it stands on its own 2 feet. And I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in the intersection of politics, deception, and the impact on everyday people. And this book I give an A. The next book that I read is Go. This is a fiction book. It follows the story of a young Japanese Korean individual who, for a variety of reasons, there are cultural impacts on him for being in some ways Japanese, in some ways Korean. You have to read the book to find out more about why that distinction matters. But to me, this was a really interesting book because I got big time Catcher in the Rye vibes from it. And when I read reviews, I didn't see anyone else mentioning that, but to me it was very strong, and it seemed very clear to me that this was heavily inspired by Catcher in the Rye. This is a controversial opinion, but Catcher in the Rye is one of my favorite books. And so I quite enjoyed this book. It's like a Japanese Korean take on the Catcher in the Rye story. It's written in a bit of a detached way. It's a quick read. And so the book doesn't go into too much detail about characters or motivations or that sort of thing. But I think there's a lot of motivation that's implied in the story, and I really enjoyed that. I think that's a big part of what I enjoy about Catcher in the Rye, where there are some things that upon first read through, you might not even pick up on it. But then once you hear about it, or if you do a second read through, you start noticing certain details where it's like, whoa, that actually is really interesting, and that adds a layer of complexity to the characters that is easily dismissed. With that in mind, I give this book an A rating. Another book that I read was The Manicurist's Daughter, which is a memoir, and I don't tend to enjoy memoirs all that much, though from time to time there are some that I tend to really like. This book is about a woman who is the daughter of refugees due to the Vietnam War who immigrated to the US during that time. And there were certain things happening in their life that you weren't allowed to discuss. And when her mother died eventually from a botched tummy tuck, and the author goes into detail about why this is important to her, why she decided to investigate her mother's death in the way that she did. And there's a lot of soul searching in the book, and it's particularly interesting both from a gender angle as well as a race angle and even a immigrant status angle. And so I really enjoyed the thoughtfulness in this memoir. Again, memoirs aren't my favorite genre, so it did have that going against. And so I ended up giving this a B rating. And the last book that I'll mention that I read was called Fire Weather: A True Story from a Hotter World. The story focuses on the fires that took place in Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada, back in 2016. If you're not familiar with Fort McMurray, it's an oil town, and as one can imagine, there are tensions between the environment and the workers and people that live in Fort McMurray. And so the book focuses a great deal on the day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute events that unfolded during that time because the fires were catastrophic. So the book focuses on those particular fires. However, it also discusses the ways in which the oil industry impacts environmental change. And it also explores like the history of oil that I thought was quite interesting. I think this book was really good because it conveyed both the urgency once people became aware of just how significant the fires were, but also sort of the lackadaisical nature that a lot of people had until it became really clear that no, really, there are fires, like you need to leave or you're going to die. And the author does some interviews with people that lived in Fort McMurray, including some individuals who were expected to be the last people to leave when fires were literally coming up on their property line. And so it was interesting as well to see the mindset that some of these people had in terms of how they felt about their property, the need to protect it, the desire to not just give up and go, the idea that they thought that they could fight back against the fire. It's a mindset that I don't come into contact with all that often. And I could not put this book down, so I highly recommend it. I give this an S tier. In the month of April, I didn't watch any TV, or at least if I did, I don't remember any of the TV that I watched. I know there's the new Fallout TV series that just came out, and I plan on watching that in the month of May. I'm quite looking forward to it. I played a little bit of the Fallout games, but not enough to really say I have a good sense of what they're like. That said, I do plan on playing them at some point, and I've heard basically nothing but good things about the TV show, so I'm really looking forward to that. I plan on seeing the movie Civil War as well as the movie Challengers, and I'm really looking forward to those as well. And of course, books, I'm not sure I'll read whatever it is that comes in for me at the library. So that gives you a sense of some of the things that I'll be discussing in next month's May Media Roundup video. If you like this content, I hope you'll like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. If you want to do more than that, I'll have a few links in the description with other ways that you can support me. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What is some of the media that you consumed this past month that you would recommend to others, or that you would recommend others stay away from? As always, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this video, and I hope you'll be back again soon. Bye!